Okay, I know other people that are going to be joining us shortly, Chris, but I'm going to start the webinar now. And so first of all, everyone who are joining us today in Victoria and from across the country, my name is Chris Kilford. I'm the president of the Canadian International Council Victoria branch here on Vancouver Island. I'd like to welcome our CIC members, our guests, and also our guest speaker. Before we do get underway, it's important to recognize that CIC Victoria members live, work, and learn on Coast Salish territory, and in particular, the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And for those of you that are not familiar with CIC, we have branches in 19 Canadian cities with some 1,200 members who are deeply interested in international affairs and Canada's role in the world. And you can find a lot more about us just by Googling the Canadian International Council or visiting CIC Victoria's Facebook page. And if you're not a member and you'd like to join our group here on the island, just in our branch alone, we have, I think, as of this morning, around 470 members in our branch. So you're more than welcome to join us. Now, we will have a Q&A portion today. And I'm sure everyone's familiar now with Zoom Q&A. You can just scroll down to the bottom of the screen. You'll see an area for you to put in your questions for our guest speaker. So I'd like to get started, and delighted to welcome Dr. Chris Miller here with us today to speak about his new book, Chip War. It's an epic account, and I have read the whole book, and it is an epic account of the decades-long battle to control what has emerged as the world's most critical resource, microchip technology, with the United States and China increasingly in conflict. And I'm sure if you've been watching the news just in the past few days, you've seen that the United States is working diligently to limit what China can access when it comes to microchip technology. And I should say that Chris's book is currently #1 on Amazon's list of bestsellers in national and international security. Now, Chris teaches international history at Fletcher School at Tufts University, and is also he is the Eurasia Research Director in the Foreign Policy Research Institute in the United States. He's regularly quoted in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and many other places, and very much in demand, especially now with his new book. And especially also with the war in Ukraine in mind, because Chris has also written 3 other books: Putinomics, Power and Money in Resurgent Russia, The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy, another book, and We Shall Be Masters, Russia Pivots to East Asia from Peter the Great to Putin. So obviously a lot of interest in Russia as well. And Chris received his PhD and MA from Yale University and his BA in history from Harvard University. Chris, we are so glad you could take the time for us today. I do know that you need to leave for another interview at about 10:55 Pacific time, so we'll make sure that happens, and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Chris, for having me. It's nice to speak to members of the council, especially as I have some family right outside of Victoria. So good to have a chance to speak with you all virtually and hopefully in person at some point in the future. I'll try to share my screen just to put up a couple of slides to guide our discussion. And as Chris mentioned at the outset, I'll put some thoughts on the table, but then would welcome your questions or comments in the second half of our hour together. What I'd like to do is introduce some of the themes from my book, Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology, which is a history of the computer chip. And I began writing this book somewhat ignorantly, only dimly aware of many uses that computer chips had. I think, like most of you, I was aware that you can find computer chips inside of your computer, obviously inside of a phone, a smartphone. But in fact, today, semiconductors are everywhere in society. And the typical person in the US or Canada will touch many dozens, hundreds in most cases, of semiconductors in their daily lives, from your microwave to your dishwasher to your automobile, which will have dozens and probably hundreds, if it's a newer car, of semiconductors inside of it, to certainly in your smartphone or your computer. We rely on semiconductors for almost anything that has an on-off switch today, and they permeate the economy in ways that we only dimly understand. We rely on them everywhere, but we see them very, very rarely. You only really see a semiconductor if you take apart a computer or an iPhone. And for most of us, that's almost never. Now, today, around 98% of semiconductors that are produced are used in consumer goods or civilian goods, but the origins of semiconductors is in missile guidance systems. They emerged out of the early Cold War missile race when both the United States and the Soviet Union were pouring huge sums of money into a really difficult engineering challenge. The hardest part of making missiles that could fly halfway across the world was not the rocket engine. That was comparatively straightforward, nor the metallurgy involved, although there's lots of stress placed on the metal in missiles, and so there's some complex alloys that you need to have access to. But the hardest part was the computer. Getting the missile to fly where you wanted it to fly required putting some intelligence, some computing power inside of the missile. And if you think of what computers looked like in the early days of the Cold War, in the 1940s or 1950s, a computer was something that took up the space of an entire room. The most powerful computers in the late 1940s had several tens of thousands of vacuum tubes, which were the key to computing at the time, little light bulb-like devices to turn on or off, creating the ones or zeros that undergird all digital computing. And the most advanced computers could string together several tens of thousands of these vacuum tubes and thereby produce some pretty rudimentary computing power. But vacuum tubes had some problems. For one thing, you couldn't miniaturize them very easily. A computer that was the size of the room was useful for certain things, but not useful for guiding missiles. You needed a much smaller computer to miniaturize them. And vacuum tubes also had the problem of emitting light, which attracted moths. And the process of removing moths from the vacuum tubes in a computer led to the process of debugging, which is central, of course, to the computing industry today. So there were some real physical challenges to using vacuum tubes in a widespread fashion in computing. As the Pentagon put more money into trying to miniaturize computing power, a number of innovations emerged. And the key innovation was the computer chip, or the semiconductor, which is a type of material, usually silicon, with tiny circuits carved into the silicon. And the way that semiconductors are produced allowed them to be shrunk in size over time, so that today the most advanced semiconductors have tiny circuits in them that are less than a millionth the size, closer to a billionth the size of the circuits that were put in the first semiconductors invented in the 1950s. The first chip that reached commercial markets in the early 1960s had 4 of these circuits inside of it. Today, an advanced semiconductor like the one you might find in your iPhone will have around 10 billion tiny transistors inside of them. And so each of the transistors on the silicon chip inside of your iPhone will be smaller than half the size of a coronavirus. So the size involved is almost impossible to comprehend, but you need this miniature size today because that's the only way to pack billions and billions of them onto a silicon chip. And so this ability to shrink transistors, pack more of them on silicon chips, and thereby use more computing power across different types of devices is what's made possible what we rely on today, whether in your smartphone or your PC. And the origins of all of this is in the US military's demands for smaller, more powerful missile computers on its missile systems. But like in the early Cold War, as with today, military systems are crucially reliant on computing power. And although most people think about chips in the context of their PC or their smartphone, the defense industrial base and military planners at the Pentagon are focusing much more on access to the most advanced semiconductors for future military systems. And just to give you a couple of examples, if you take a comparatively old type of technology like the Javelin missile pictured here, of the type that several thousand have been transferred to Ukrainian forces over the past several months, one of these missiles will have over 200 semiconductors inside. And this is a missile that was designed several decades ago. So this is not a new technology, but nevertheless, very heavily reliant on microelectronics to guide it to its target and hit a tank as planned. If you look at more advanced technologies, in particular at how defense planners are envisioning future military systems, what you'll find is a vision of warfare in which computing power distributed across the battle space, memory power needed to provide the memory for lots of different platforms to operate complex software, and a whole lot of signals processing, all of which require semiconductors. What you find is a vision of the battle space like this one produced by America's Defense Advanced Projects Research Agency, in which semiconductors are everywhere on a battlefield, in ships, in planes, on satellites, powering drones, on ground vehicles. And that's already to some extent the case, but the amount of computing expected to take place on edge devices like this one, rather than in larger data centers, is going to grow exponentially. And the amount of sensors on the battlefield will grow substantially as well. And what that means is that the future of war is likely to be decided and shaped to no small degree by access to the most advanced semiconductors. And if you imagine, for example, what it takes to fly a unmanned aerial vehicle through a contested battle space, that vehicle's little drone has got to know what's going on around it, which requires infrared sensors, radar sensors, visual, optical sensors, often a LiDAR sensor. It's got to be able to make sense of all the data that's coming in. It's got to be able to communicate securely, often over several different types of communication channels, satellites to other drones around it, forces on the ground. It's got to be able to put all of these different information sources together to fly accurately to reach its target. It's got to be able to ideally evade adversary systems along the way, and that's an increasing challenge. And then potentially even identify plausible targets when it reaches its destination. All of that requires a whole lot of computing power, of sensing power, of communications power, and therefore of semiconductors. So any vision of the future of war that you see today is vitally reliant on access to chips. And it's not only in the United States where defense planners are thinking about the future of warfare as above all a question of applying computing and applying intelligence to military systems. And in China, similarly, there's a concept called, it sort of translates badly in English, but military intelligentization, making military systems smarter so they can think on their own. And any thinking on their own requires access to semiconductors, processor chips, memory chips, and also signal processing chips to make sense of the signals that are coming in. So the US-China military balance will be shaped in no small part on the ability of these two militaries to apply computing power and apply sensing power to their military systems. Which is why today both countries, and indeed not only the US and China, but those two leading the way, are focused above all on semiconductors in a way they haven't really been for many decades. In the United States, the focal point of this effort has been the Chips and Science Act that was just signed into law, which will fund $39 billion of incentives for building advanced chips in the United States. In addition to that, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Projects Research Agency, has over the past couple of years launched a new initiative called the Electronics Resurgence Initiative, funding a variety of new chip making and chip design techniques. And then finally, the Commerce Department, as recently as last week, has dramatically tightened the ability of US firms to transfer equipment and finished chips to China. And the US is doing this for a couple of reasons. First off, in terms of the incentives provided by the Chips and Science Bill, although the US was home to the initial inventions that gave birth to the semiconductor industry, today almost all advanced chip fabrication occurs in East Asia. 90% of the world's most advanced processor chips are made on one island, the island of Taiwan. Around 45% of the world's most advanced memory chips are made in Korea. And for the rest of the world, this presents an extraordinary vulnerability in case something were to go wrong in the Taiwan Straits. And just to put that into context, the chips we're talking about, of which 90% come from Taiwan, include all chips in an iPhone, include around a third of PC processor chips, a large number of the chips that are used for AI applications in data centers, a large number of the chips that go on cell phone towers make possible to build out a new cell phone infrastructure. If Taiwan were to be knocked offline by either an earthquake or a war, the world would produce 1/3 less additional computing power in the subsequent year. So today we think of ourselves as on the brink of building 5G networks or building the metaverse. And if Taiwan didn't exist in terms of the semiconductor industry after some sort of crisis, we'd be struggling to source not only chips for iPhones or chips for AI and data centers, but chips for dishwashers and autos to Taiwan is just so important in terms of its advanced production, in terms of its overall capacity. Second, the U.S. is responding to a almost decade-long project by the Chinese government to win a much larger stake in the global semiconductor industry for China. And over the past decade, since 2014, the Chinese government has been pouring tens of billions and probably in aggregate several $100 billion into its chip industry. The total number is actually kind of opaque because in addition to national government subsidies, there's provincial and local government subsidies in China, which are difficult to get complete visibility into. But the number is very large, almost certainly multiple times larger than the types of semiconductor subsidies that have been approved by the US or Europe in the past year. And China's goal is to win a larger chunk of the market for chip making. For China, this is a crucial strategic as well as economic challenge because today China spends more money importing semiconductors than it spends importing oil. And it's spent more money importing semiconductors than oil for most of the past decade. It does this because although China is the assembly facility for most of the world's electronic devices, if you actually look, for example, at what it takes to make an iPhone, most of the iPhone's components are imported to China where they're finally assembled into a final iPhone. So the memory chip comes from Korea, the main processor chip comes from Taiwan, the camera sensor comes, which is also a type of semiconductor, comes from Japan, and only around 10 or 15% of the value of components in an iPhone is actually made in China. Most of the chips have to be imported. And so if you look at an iPhone, it will say on the back, designed in California, assembled in China. But that's actually a very deceptive statement by Apple. The true statement would be designed in California, manufactured primarily in Taiwan, and then assembled in China, because much of the value added in an iPhone actually accrues to the Taiwanese firm that manufactures many of the crucial chips inside. And so China, for economic reasons, has wanted to win some of this market for itself, but also for strategic reasons, because China realizes that it's not only vulnerable to blockades measured in barrels of oil, but also blockades measured in bytes. And for China, there's no greater risk than that its geopolitical rivals reduce or cut off its access to advanced semiconductors, because there's no way China can produce them domestically. And that is a claim that surprises many people. But in fact, the semiconductor industry, although production of chips is focused in East Asia, above all, when it comes to advanced chips in Taiwan and South Korea, many of the crucial machine tools and software tools that are necessary to produce semiconductors are produced not in Asia, but in the US, in Japan, and in the Netherlands. And in fact, there are 5 companies that produce the most important tools needed to make advanced semiconductors today. And these 5 companies have had sort of an oligopolistic position in the industry for most of the past several decades. And they've been able to maintain this market position because they alone, compared to any other company in the world, have the knowledge to produce the machines that can actually carve into silicon chips billions and billions of circuits, each one smaller than half a coronavirus. This is something that their machines can do and no one else's can do. And so if you look at the companies involved, for example, the Dutch firm ASML, which produces 100% of the advanced lithography machines without which you can't make an advanced semiconductor, you'll find engineering knowledge that is unparalleled anywhere in the world. Let me just describe for a moment what it takes to make an advanced lithography machine, a machine that you've probably never heard of, but is in fact the most expensive machine tool in human history, costing $150 million a piece. Lithography is the step in the semiconductor manufacturing process whereby you shine rays of light onto chemicals that were deposited on top of the silicon wafer and thereby project patterns that carve the transistors into a chip. For a long time, we used visible light to do this, but visible light has a wavelength of several hundred nanometers, which is vastly too large for covering the handful of nanometers that are needed in the most advanced semiconductors. So over the past couple of decades, the wavelength of light used in lithography has shrunk, such to the fact that today, the light used is 13.5 nanometers in wavelength. Extreme ultraviolet light is what it's called. And producing extreme ultraviolet light at the quantities necessary to manufacture advanced chips has been one of the greatest engineering challenges of our time. Doing so requires dropping balls of tin 30 microns, that's millionths of a meter wide, through a vacuum at a speed of several hundred miles per hour, pulverizing them with one of the most powerful lasers ever invented for commercial use twice. They explode then into a plasma measuring several 100,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside of this machine, there's a plasma at that extraordinary temperature, close to the temperature you'll find on the outer surfaces of the sun. That plasma emits the right amount of light, which is then collected via the flattest mirrors ever invented and directed towards a silicon chip. Now, making these machines took 30 years of scientific and engineering advances, and the complexity involved, it explains why they cost $150 million a piece. And you need machines that are about as complicated to deposit thin films a couple atoms wide on top of semiconductors, or to etch tiny canyons a couple atoms wide into semiconductors, or to inspect the semiconductor once it's done and learn whether each of the tiny canyons or thin films that you've put down is actually structured as you'd hoped it to be. Doing this is the most precise manufacturing challenge ever. And so the companies that have the machines that can do it have unique market position, which gives the countries that make these machines a fair amount of power over how and where chips are produced. And because these machines are produced by a small number of companies in just 3 countries, these 3 countries have a lot of say into the shape of the global semiconductor industry. And when these machines are not able to be procured by another country, that country simply can't make advanced chips. And that's the challenge that China finds itself in today, because as of last week, the US has prohibited the transfer to China, not only of the most advanced tools, but also of the sort of second generation most advanced tools as well, deliberately trying to restrain China's advances in semiconductors and in advanced computing more generally. So China is spending very heavily to build up its semiconductor industry. It's spending predominantly at the low edge of technology, which is where it has access to the machine tools that are needed and has the domestic capabilities to do so. And so even if China fails to make any progress towards the cutting edge, it's still going to have a massive increase in the amount of capacity that it produces at the low edge, such that by the end of the decade, China will probably produce around a quarter of all chips produced in the world. And that's going to have major ramifications for the industry in terms of the profitability of existing firms, as well as in terms of the shape of the electronics sector more generally. And this is something that gives China some hope of making progress, and also creates a lot of concern in the United States, in Japan, in Taiwan, and in South Korea, which are hesitant and don't want to lose any of their existing market share. And because of the competition for influence in the chip industry, we've seen technological tensions intensify over the past couple of years, with the US rolling out new restrictions on China and its access to chip making technology, as well as to advanced chips, and China trying to find new ways around these restrictions domestically or by working with other countries. So it's clear that these new competitive dynamics will have a major impact on the industry, and supply chains as a result are changing. One example of this is that Taiwan's biggest chip maker, TSMC, the world's most advanced chip maker, is for the first time really ever building substantial facilities outside of Taiwan, in Japan, in the United States, in the state of Arizona, and probably soon in Singapore and Europe as well. So TSMC is going to be building comparatively advanced chips, not the most advanced chips, but relatively advanced chips outside of Taiwan. That's a new change in just the past couple of years. Second, China has been cut off from most of the types of machinery you need to make an advanced chip. I mentioned that EUV lithography equipment is just one example of equipment that China won't be allowed to buy for some time. Third, the US has rolled out a set of restrictions before last week, prohibiting any company working with the most advanced architecture of transistors to share that technology or produce that technology in China. So there's a desire to stop China in its tracks in terms of its current production capabilities and prevent it from moving forward. Fourth, regardless of this, China's build out in terms of fabrication capacity is going to have a dramatic effect at the low-tech end of the market, because China's already got the domestic technology needed to do the low-tech stuff. And so China will play a bigger role in the industry, even if it fails to move up to the cutting edge. And then finally, in the places where China looks like it's getting closer to the cutting edge, and the best example of this is memory chip firm called YMTC, which seemed to be close to commercial competitiveness and which Apple was actually evaluating for use in iPhones, now faces new export controls from the US, which will likely have a pretty dramatic effect at halting its technological advance. So where China's gotten close, the US has tightened controls to make sure it can't take any further steps forward. So what does all this mean in the big picture before I wrap up and open to your comments and questions? First, I think from an economic perspective, there's some risk for the entire semiconductor industry, which is that when every government is trying to subsidize its own industry, there's a risk of overcapacity. And the fact that the Chinese government, the Japanese government, the European Union, the United States, Korea, and Taiwan are all subsidizing their chip industries, and in particular, putting subsidies in building out manufacturing capacity, suggests there's some risk that we globally build too much capacity and have overcapacity as a problem. And if you look at capital expenditures in the chip industry, they're almost double this year of what they were 2 years ago. Chip demand is growing, but it might not be growing at that tremendous rate. So I think there's some worry that we actually build more capacity than we need, and as a result have chip firms that, whatever their technological capabilities, simply aren't profitable. That's one. Two is that supply chains really are shifting in a way that every major investment adjacent to the semiconductor industry or in it must now consider the risk of export controls. For a long time, chip firms didn't really take seriously the prospect that politics might get in the way of their business. Over the past 20 years of globalization and expanding trade and technological flows across the Pacific Ocean, there was a sense in the industry that they got to set the tune for what supply chains looked like, and now that's no longer the case. Every chip firm is looking over their shoulder at regulatory risks and investing with these new considerations in mind. And above all, what this means is substantially less investment from foreign chip firms, whether Korean, Taiwanese, US, or others in China, and less Chinese investment in the chip sectors of other countries. So in both directions, investment is slowing meaningfully. And finally, I think there's some risk in China that its massive semiconductor subsidies prove too expensive. It's already the case that they're getting large, and as China's economy slows down, spending many tens of billions of dollars more on a policy that's unlikely to get China close to the cutting edge might end up seeming like a poor policy choice. Right now, China's doing everything it can to reach self-sufficiency, but whether that continues going forward, I don't know. And the fact is that China's spending on advanced technology has already gotten large enough as a budget line item to make it into IMF charts like this one. The green line on this chart is spending via special government funds, which is largely about high-tech equipment. And as you can see, China's debt burden from its government has grown dramatically over the past couple of years, and a not insignificant portion of that debt is now debt taken on by government funds in the tech space. So there's some chance that China decides on its own, just can't afford to build its own semiconductor industry. So to wrap up, semiconductors are used by all of us in smartphones or PCs, but that's not the only way they matter. And the reality is that both in Beijing and in Washington, security and defense-focused officials are winning a larger say in how the industry is structured. Second, tech policy in all of the major capitals will be increasingly thought of via this geopolitical lens. We've thought a lot about tech policy in recent years through the lenses of anti-monopoly or privacy or data protection, and that's not going away. But the security lens, I think, is going to be more and more important as policymakers come to terms with the fact that the military balance will be profoundly shaped by access to computing power. And then finally, the reality is that supply chains are shifting dramatically, and the shape of globalization that we've come to take it for granted over the past several decades is changing, not overnight, but investment trends have already shifted in the chip industry and the electronic industry, and we should expect more shifts going forward as these political factors come to the fore and economic efficiency takes a backseat to security concerns. So I'll stop there, but would be delighted to answer any questions you have or hear any comments.
Oh, thank you, Chris. And, when I read your book, what was clear was the title was true, Chip War. You don't really think about a war over semiconductors, but what we Well, what your book showed and what we've seen more recently is that there is a fight going on between the United States and China in particular over access and the future of where this is all going. So it really is a war. We're getting focused on the war in Ukraine, perhaps another Cold War, but there's a chip war actually going on. So for our audience, we do have the Q&A section, and I see Lou has a question up. But Lou, before I get to your question, I just wanted to come back, Chris, and ask you, I think, first of all, this particular book, because up until now, you've been focusing on economic issues, Russia in particular. This is, of course, an economic issue. It has ties to the economy, the global economy. But what compelled you or inspired you to write Chip War?
Well, as you mentioned, Chris, I'm a historian of Russia by training, and I was interested in writing a book on missile technology in the early Cold War. And the question I wanted to ask was, it's clear that the Soviet Union had a lot of smart scientists. It's clear they were able to succeed in certain scientific technological endeavors. They had a massive atomic weapons program, for example, which requires a lot of science. They were the first country to shoot a satellite and then a person into outer space, which is a real accomplishment. And in terms of brilliant physicists, Russia is in many ways second to none. And in fact, a number of the key Nobel Prizes in physics in the semiconductor space went to Soviet or Russian scientists. But for whatever reason, Russia couldn't miniaturize computing power. The Soviet Union couldn't. And that's the puzzle that I wanted to start answering. And I thought it would just be sort of a history of the arms race and computing power in the early Cold War. And I was working on that issue around 2016, 2017, 2018, right as the US began rolling out its first restrictions on companies, Chinese companies like ZTE and Huawei, which were focused on access to electronic components and semiconductors. And I started realizing that there was actually an interesting linkage between the strategic issue then and the tools that the US was using for its restrictions against those two Chinese companies today. I think the third data point that made me realize that semiconductors were a lot more important than I understood was when I realized that China spent more money importing chips than it spends importing oil. And when I first looked at that data, I had to download the data 3 more times from the UN website to make sure I was getting it right, because it just sounded absurd. Mm-hmm. That no one thinks about buying semiconductors as a large part of any country's trade. And yet there it was. And it's not just China. For Taiwan, 42% of exports are semiconductors. For the Philippines and Malaysia, over a quarter of exports are semiconductors. For Korea, over 15% are semiconductors. And so I came to realize that actually my vision of globalization in Asia and trans-Pacific supply chains was just totally wrong. I sort of thought about globalization as being about container ships, shipping textiles and toys and TVs, and that wasn't it. Actually, the most important traded good in Asia, which is the most densely knit part of structure of the global economy, is semiconductors. And if you look at other types of goods that are traded widely throughout Asia and the world, it's largely goods that wouldn't exist if it weren't for semiconductors, phones, computers, telecoms equipment. And so you can't understand globalization, I can realize, unless you understand the absolutely central role of the chip. And so I strung those 3 things together: the origins of chips and the missile race, the role of the chip in really structuring globalization as we know it today, and then the importance of chips in the US-China competition. And the more I dug into the industry, the more I was intrigued and surprised to find out that despite China's immense manufacturing base, China is still far behind at the types of ultra-precision manufacturing that are crucial to making chips. And that to me seemed like something that was worthy of exploration. And the more I dug, the more important chips seemed just about everything I wanted to understand in the world.
Wow. And you mentioned Taiwan. And I think that was one of the more surprising things for me reading your book, that so much of the industry was centered on Taiwan. And of course, there's always issues between China and Taiwan. And more recently, I was reading that people on Taiwan were saying, well, if we were to be invaded, it wouldn't matter if our semiconductor plants were captured by the Chinese, because they then wouldn't have access to the high-tech equipment that you've been speaking about and so on. So it wouldn't really matter. Nevertheless, I'm sure the disruption would be huge. And I began to ask myself, why Taiwan? How did Taiwan become so central to this story?
There's a couple of reasons. Some are related to Taiwan. Some are related to the company TSMC, which is the biggest company in Taiwan, and some are related to the founder of TSMC, Morris Chang. So first off, let me start with Morris Chang, who I think is the most interesting person in the world that hardly anyone's ever heard of. Morris Chang was born in mainland China, fled to British-controlled Hong Kong in the early stages of the Sino-Japanese War during the first years of World War II, then fled again to Chongqing during the war. When the communists took power, fled to the United States after that, enrolled at Harvard and then MIT before he was hired by Texas Instruments and built the semiconductor industry in Texas, which is one of the key centers of chip technology. Until in one of the greatest errors of business history, he was passed over for the CEO job. He wanted to be CEO, and he was runner-up for CEO, and so he was out of a job in his mid-50s, looking for something new to do, and he was approached by the government of Taiwan. And the government of Taiwan was interested in semiconductors because it was looking for ways to integrate itself more deeply with the United States economically, because the Taiwanese were concerned that they were small, China was big, and they needed US security guarantees to preserve their autonomy. And they were concerned that their political importance alone wasn't enough to justify security guarantees. They needed economic importance as well. And so the Taiwanese government had identified chips as a sector in which they could attract investment by major US corporations and plug themselves into the growing tech sector. And so they gave Morris Chang basically a blank check to build a new business. And Chang proposed a new business model at the time. Before he founded TSMC in 1987, most chips were designed and fabricated, manufactured by the same company. And Chang wanted to do it differently. He said, there will be customers who only want to design their chips. Let them come to me. I will design nothing and only manufacture. And at the time, it was a radical idea, sort of like a Gutenberg moment, like Gutenberg in the printing press, where it was no longer the case you had to write your own book and print it. You could go to Gutenberg and get him to print your books. And that's what Morris Chang wanted to be for semiconductors. You could design it and he'd print it for you. And it seemed like a wild idea at the time. It was certainly something that had never been tried before, but it proved to be immensely successful. And so TSMC is the world's most successful chip firm today. It's grown from a small size to being the biggest producer of processor chips, and it has the most advanced technology. And it's made Taiwan the beating heart of the digital world. We can't have smartphones, we can't have PCs and the quantities we have them, cell phone towers, data centers, everything relies on chips produced on Taiwan at TSMC.
So while we are focused on China and Taiwan, I have a question from Paul Saguna here. The United States put an oil embargo on Imperial Japan in the past, and now it seems that maybe the United States is putting a chip embargo on China. Could this be a source of something breaking out in the region because of what is happening?
Well, I think there are risks, and that is an analogy one can draw. I'm not sure it's the analogy that I would draw, but yes, I think any set of restrictions brings risks. I think not restricting also brings risks, and that's the balance that the U.S. government has been trying to strike. And I think if you look at the military balance around the Taiwan Straits and the Western Pacific in general, what you'll find is over the past couple of years, really over the past 2 decades, it's shifted really dramatically in China's favor. And by almost any forecast, that will continue over the next 5 or so years, shifting in China's favor. And so the question is, how comfortable or not comfortable are you with that dynamic? And the reality is that it's hard to see a major shift in U.S. defense spending, and certainly hard to see an upward shift in U.S. defense spending over the next 5 years. So U.S. isn't going to be able to match China ship for ship or plane for plane. I think it's possible you'd see a slight downward shift in Chinese defense spending, but I think there too we have to assume current trends continue. And so long as that's the case, the U.S. will become less and less able to defend Taiwan or other allies, Korea, Japan, in the region. Now, there's less worry about Korea and Japan. Taiwan is obviously the highest risk point. But the fact is that everyone knows that American military power relative to Chinese military power is declining. And I think that does create risks. And so if you ask yourself, well, what can the US plausibly do about that? You could say, well, you could build more ships and planes. Maybe, but that's very expensive. And the reality is we're already running a large budget deficit, so probably not viable. And indeed, the US has done better in the past when it's not competed plane for plane or tank for tank. That's not an optimal strategy. It's better to compete on quality rather than quantity. And today, quality basically just means computing power. Because when you think about where the US has advantages over China, it's not in producing better materials for weapons systems. There's some unique advantages in submarine construction or aircraft engine construction, where the US still does have durable leads, but those alone aren't going to be decisive in a future war. And when it comes to computing systems, there's very little evidence the US has any advantage in devising algorithms, for example, and writing software compared to China, which is a country that has lots and lots of smart programmers. Where the US does have an advantage today, and where I think it plausibly will have an advantage over the next half decade, maybe over the next decade, is in producing transistors. And the more transistors you produce, the less smart your software has to be more powerful. And so if you figure China and the US will have comparably smart software, but the US has multiple times more access to computing power, raw computing power, then that's where you can bet your advantage. And that's basically what the US is saying. It's saying we're not going to compete ship to ship or tank for tank. We're not going to compete on having smarter software. We're not going to compete on having more data. At best, we'll be at parity, but we're going to keep the advantage in having a lot more access to a lot more transistors. And with this raw computing power advantage, hope that we'll be able to have smarter military systems than the Chinese and at least slow the decline in the relative military balance in the Taiwan Straits. So that's the strategy.
Right, thank you. I'd like to take you back to Putinomics, and this will tie into Lou Namovsky's question about Russia and Ukraine, because in Putinomics, you had argued that Russia was falling behind and it would become a 21st century laggard when it came to microchips and so forth. And now what we're watching in Ukraine is apparently it almost seems like Russia's run out of chips and high-tech weaponry, and now everything's coming home to roost, so to speak. Is this an issue for Russia at the moment?
It is. It's a huge issue. Russia domestically has a very, very small and backwards semiconductor industry. And we know that their ability to produce advanced weapon systems is severely limited by a number of factors, but microelectronics and chips are very clearly one of them. If you take apart the guidance computers of Russian military systems that have been acquired in Ukraine, we've now got several good open source studies of Russian guidance computers. What you find is a lot of US, Korean, and Taiwanese chips inside. So the reality is that Russia's already relying on smuggled chips. And now that controls are even tighter, Russia will face more difficulty in accessing those chips. And relying on smuggled chips is not a great strategy. It's a fine strategy. It's not a great strategy because A, you never know when your smuggling pathways get disrupted. B, you're accessing things that are probably a generation or two behind the cutting edge just because that's easier to smuggle. And third, you never know whether the chips you're getting are sort of genuine black market chips or planted there by someone. And there's a special division of the FSB, the Russian Security Services, whose task it is to try to verify that the chips Russia is receiving are actually genuine. And then you ask, how confident do you think the Russians are that they're capable of verifying that a chip with 1 billion transistors on it is in fact genuine or hasn't been modified? So I think there's probably a lot of uncertainty in the Russian defense industrial complex as to whether in fact the microelectronics actually work or have been sabotaged in some way. And whether the smugglers they're buying from them are actually just smugglers in it for themselves or smugglers employed by some adversary spy agency.
I have the same problem when I want to purchase razor heads for my razor. Are they the real thing or not? So I can see the problem there. I have a question from David King here. I think he's asking about lithography machines in Taiwan. I think there are in Taiwan.
Yep.
And yes.
Yes. So Taiwan is able to import lithography machines from ASML, which are the most advanced in the Netherlands. And then once they're in Taiwan, though, they need spare parts when they break down. They require regular software updates. And so ASML has staff in person at every of its advanced lithography system in the world. So could you operate it without ASML's personnel? Maybe, but it would be tough. And in reality, Taiwan is so dependent on chemicals. There's ultra specialized, super pure chemicals you need to import, largely from Japan. Software tools from the US, that Taiwan alone cannot operate a cutting-edge semiconductor industry. No one can. It takes a combination of Taiwan, Korea, Japan, the US, and the Netherlands to do it.
Yeah, I think that ties into a comment that David Wessler has here, where he's talking about the design of the chips and everything that's involved. And it was readily apparent to me when I was reading your book how I think at one point I think you may have said that this was arguably the most important human achievement ever achieved in terms of.
I think that's arguable. Certainly, it's the most complicated manufacturing, and we've produced more transistors each year than the combined total of all the manufactured goods in all of human history. And think about
Right.
your iPhone will have 15 to 20,000 transistors inside of it. That's more 15 20 billion transistors inside of it. And that's vastly more than the number of automobiles or bicycles or anything else that's been ever produced. So the numbers are really mind-boggling. And because the manufacturing is so complicated, only a small number of companies know how to do it.
Now, we've been speaking about Taiwan and China and the United States. Do you know much about what's happening up here in Canada? Is there a semiconductor sector?
There's a number of pretty specialized chip design firms, especially around the Toronto area in particular. And chip design is not the complicated manufacturing, but it's actually the highest value-added part of the supply chain. And so there's one well-known firm in the space of designing chips for AI applications, data centers in Toronto, for example. So that's a place where Canada does have a small but meaningful role in the supply chain.
One of the things that came to me when reading your book was how many companies have actually come and gone over our very short lifetimes, like Nortel. Being, there's a lot to discuss there, but I think that was also valuable too, because it just showed how challenging this market is, getting it right. And we have a question here. Has there been any difference between what you saw with the Trump administration and now what you see with the Biden administration when it comes to tackling the whole issue of microchips, when it comes to, say, like China and the policies there?
I think there's a lot of continuity in the diagnosis of the challenge, in terms of the sense that the U.S. military is falling behind in relative terms, and in terms of the conclusion that computing power is the edge that the U.S. has. That's something the Pentagon was actually talking about even under the Obama administration. So it dates back about a decade. In terms of the specific tools used, I think the Trump administration was a bit more ad hoc and less structured in its approach. And so if you look at the rule that was released last week by the Commerce Department, I think there was a substantially more consultation and breadth of thinking put into it. Some of the Trump administration's rules were released and then they didn't work exactly as planned and then were rescinded or amended. Whereas I suspect the rule released last week will be in place for some time.
Yeah, I also just very briefly wanted to mention how this has impacted Huawei and ZTE in terms of their access to 5G, and even here in Canada, 4G, being told to remove their products out of the 4G network as well. Has this damaged Huawei in any way? Overall, its prospects?
Well, it has, yeah. I mean, it's forced Huawei to divest its smartphone business, to divest its cloud computing business. Huawei's finances are kind of opaque, but I think by any metric, the company is suffering really substantially financially as a result. And then Huawei can't get access to multiple types of chips that they used to produce in Taiwan. They're no longer allowed to produce in Taiwan. And because Taiwan can only produce advanced chips with US machine tools, Taiwan has to enforce certain US export controls. And in the case of Huawei, the US prevented Taiwan from selling advanced chips to Huawei. And so if you're trying to build a cell phone tower, for example, you need advanced chips in the box at the top of the cell phone tower that manages the radio signals. Same thing in a smartphone. You can make a smartphone with a not advanced chip, but it will operate like an iPhone 3 rather than an iPhone 14, and there's not much of a market for that. So being cut off from advanced chips is a real impediment to Huawei and any tech company that's trying to stay competitive. And if you think about what it means to not be advanced in an industry where every 2 years there's a doubling of computing power. If you're 2 years behind or 4 years behind or 10 years behind, you're really far behind.
Yeah, definitely. And I see we're coming up to 10:52, and I know you have you had an interview before speaking with us, and you've got one coming up as well. So I think what I'll do is I'll bring our little session with you to a close. And for the audience, I have to say this book was terrific. I really enjoyed reading it, and I learned so much. And in preparing for today, I was on YouTube looking at how this whole industry operates, and it was mind-boggling. So Chris, thank you for spending such a lot of time preparing this book and getting it into publications. It's something to be incredibly proud of, I would think. And I did take note that you have family here in Victoria. So if you are this way, we would love to host you in person at one of our big events. So keep that in mind. I have a few quick closing remarks for our folks. Do you have anything you'd like to just say before we leave you today?
Well, I'll just thank you for the opportunity to share my book, and appreciated all of the questions and discussion.
Well, thank you for taking your time, because I know you are in such high demand. And for the audience, we have a lot more events coming up. And Chris, you may be interested in this. We'll be looking at midterm elections in the US, the outcome and what it might mean for us up here in Canada. And if you're a guest here today, please consider joining the Canadian International Council, because we have great events like this one with Chris today. So on that note, Chris, I will let you run off to your next interview. It's been a real delight to have you with us, and thank you to the audience for participating today. Take care.
Great.
Thanks,
you,
Chris. Very much appreciated.